Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. My next guest, Michael Addis, is truly an expert on work within the realm of men and masculinity. Some of his credits include Professor of Psychology at Clark University, Fellow of the American Psychological Association, and past President of the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities. Personally, Michael identifies as an author, as a social scientist, and as a father. His recent book, The Psychology of Men in Context, which he co-authored with Ethan Hoffman, provides foundational knowledge about the history, current scholarship, and social implications of psychological study of men and masculinity. No big deal, right? The focus of his current work is finding ways to encourage men to recognize emotional distress in their lives and communicate it to others beyond professionals. Let's all for a moment imagine a world where more men had this tool and the permission to use it. Because, well, this is necessary in the forward march toward wholeness. I'm grateful to have Michael on the New Masculine, and I'm anxious to hear what wisdom he has to add. So let's hear from him. Welcome, Michael.
Great to be here, Travis.
Thank you so much for joining me. So clearly you have some expertise in the fields of masculinity and men and understanding of psychology and research. Is there anything else that we need to know about you before we jump into this conversation?
I don't think so. No, I don't. It makes me uncomfortable hearing you read all of those sort of highfalutin titles, because one of the things I've learned over the years is all of that sort of academic dress maybe enhances credibility for communicating with some men, but also can be really off-putting. I'm off-put by it sometimes too. So yeah, I'm Michael. I'm sitting at my desk right now with a bunch of guitars behind me.
I get that, and I totally value that. And honestly, who you are as Michael is what I'm most interested in connecting with. And I also think there's some helpful sort of tangential kind of identities that you hold that help give some idea about why you might have an opinion or a perspective that's worth sharing on in our conversations around masculinity.
For sure. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about this.
Yeah. So let's hear a few of your own personal stories when it comes to this. You've got all this professional experience, but what's your own journey with masculinity been like?
Yeah, you mentioned when we talked earlier that we were going to talk about this. I was thinking about it this morning and thinking, boy, it's a tough question to answer. Maybe it's because I'm a psychologist, and I think usually when someone asks, like, well, how did you get to this place? The true answer is way more complicated than we like to believe, and so for example, in my own case, I think the first time I ever thought about myself as a man, even not as just a person, but sort of a gendered being was maybe right when I started graduate school. And I started noticing that, there were far more women coming in for mental health services than men. And most of the people training me were women. And most of my peers at that point were women as well, becoming clinical psychologists. And I started to seek out, I think it was probably the first time I ever felt as a white man in a non-dominant position. Looking back at it now, I think I was starting to feel like, okay, maybe there's something about being a man that's putting me a little out of sync with the environment that I'm in. And I started to look for, things like men's groups or research on men's mental health. And there was just very little associated with that. At that time, that was not a research trajectory for a career that I was comfortable pursuing. I mean, I needed to do something much more mainstream. And so fast forward 15 years later, and I'm at Clark University, and I began to study it academically. I mean, specifically trying to figure out why so few men utilize mental health services compared to women. Now, of course, there's a whole now that I've learned about this stuff, I realize that my interest in men and masculinity didn't start at age 22. My education from society started before birth.
Yeah, I was going to say that's pretty fascinating that your first sort of ideas of being a gendered being were not until you were 22 or so. Like
Yeah.
that seems really late. I think in so much of our culture, we're taught what a boy is and what a girl is, and that there are two distinct categories that people fit into. And boys can do certain things and girls can do other things.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what I mean by the first time I thought of myself as a gendered being is not that I hadn't been socialized to be a man. I mean, I knew I've got to do sports. I've got to lead conversations, not listen. I need to make money. I need to, all the ideas about sexuality and the body that go along with traditional masculinity. But I think I didn't realize that those things were ideas rather than facts, and that they might be actually affecting me. They might be affecting my experience and my training and the kinds of relationships I'm capable of building and not building. I think that's when I began to sort of take a more critical stance towards the whole enterprise of masculinity.
Yeah, and so what was that process like for you of taking a more critical stance on that? I think in some ways it's really challenging for us as men to take what has been just given to us and to actually be able to zoom out and see it from at the outside and take a critical eye to it. So much of the time we're so immersed in it that it's hard to be critical of it. It's hard. We just assume that it is who we are and what we are. How is that process like for you to zoom out and take a critical perspective on it?
Well, it's a good question. It works in different life contexts to different degrees and in different ways. So as an academic researcher, taking a wide view is generally encouraged, as long as you can also, sort of zero in on a sort of a more precise focus. Although, as I say that, I mean, there was pushback to studying men and masculinity from within my field, even. I mean, people who I respected as professionals who knew me as a straightforward clinical psychology researcher. And then I said, well, I'm switching that. I'm changing to study men. And I remember one very prominent researcher saying, oh, we were all waiting for you to realize that. Like he made a homophobic coming out joke, right? And so, but see, that sort of stuff just fueled my interest in it even more. Like, why is this so significant for so many men? And for me, I mean, not like I'm above it. So I think as a professional enterprise, it's been really gratifying. I think personally, it's challenging, as I'm sure you found, and I'm sure many of your listeners have, is masculinity is there in society for a reason. And if you question it and you push against it, it will push back. And that's not just an abstract statement. That comes into intimate relationships and friendships between men and relationships with women and the whole shebang.
I think that's absolutely true. I think it's painfully true how clear that is in our culture right now. I think we're getting to look at a lot of places where we're challenging masculinity. We're challenging systems that were created by men that are very patriarchal, that keep some in power and some not in power. And I think in the U.S. culture, at least, we're really getting to look at what the consequences are of challenging that, because there are consequences for sure.
No doubt.
My understanding is that you've been teaching about men and masculinity for a long time at the college level. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
I love doing it. It's one of the most gratifying things I've done in the last 25 years. So, when I started this, there were just a handful of courses around the country in the psychology of men. And James O'Neill at the University of Connecticut had one, and a couple of other colleagues. But I think there was a feeling that this is a really important skill set for young people to have. And by skill set, I mean simply the ability to see how gender operates in the lives of not just women, right, but of all people. And men have been the great, invisible group when it comes to gender. Historically, we don't get talked about. We don't focus on ourselves too much as gendered beings. I always say one of the first rules of masculinity is don't talk about masculinity.
Well, that's so true. I didn't even think about that. There's that stereotype in my mind of when I think of somebody who's done gender studies, it's
Always.
always a woman or a
Yes.
queer person. It's
It's
never
never
a man.
a straight cisgender male or a white. It's the same. I mean, these things intersect, right? So it's in the same way that when you think of race and ethnicity, we don't think about Donald Trump, right, or Michael Addis. We don't think about white people. We think about whoever has been constructed as other. So yeah, I think to get back to teaching, there's I think a feeling amongst the people that do this work that we're at the relative beginning stages of something really important. And in many ways, standing on the shoulders of women and women's and gender studies, right? In trying to see how gender restricts human functioning and trying to apply that to men's lives as well. The students who come into the class are typically women, right? It takes, I think, a certain amount of curiosity and courage and self-reflection for men to even enter that class. But I would say certainly the level of passion that they bring to the course is really, really exciting for me. And for a lot of students, this is the first time they've thought about themselves or their brother or their father or their grandfather, and questions like, why is he angry? Is it okay that he's so angry? Is there perhaps pain beneath all the anger? And I feel privileged to witness some of these sorts of transformational experiences that students are having.
Yeah, I so appreciate that because I think that's true to my experience of a good portion of the listeners of this podcast are women and people that don't necessarily fall on the gender binary towards being a man, towards the masculine side of things. And I think I also appreciate that you acknowledge that this new field that's emerging is really standing on the shoulders of the women that have done this gender studies and had been looking at these things for a long time and using what has worked and using the wisdom and knowledge that have been created in those to sort of help continue informing the work we're doing around men and masculinity. I think it's important to acknowledge where this work has
Yes.
started and to give credit to those who have been ahead of the curve. I think it makes sense to me that you have a high portion of females that enter your class because as you're saying, like it takes a level of pain, a level of discomfort, a level of lack of power in this world to really start asking those questions, to start asking the questions of why am I the way I am? Why can't I verbalize my emotions? Why can't I share when I feel vulnerable and weak? It takes a level of challenge oftentimes for people to get to that place where they start asking those questions, that they start looking around and going, oh, this is a collective experience, not just an individual experience that I'm having.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's good to hear you normalize that, because I think I've felt for a long time that and these things are not incompatible, but that as much as we are standing on the shoulders of women and women do want to understand what's going on with men need to get involved in this. And I feel so strongly about that our own ability to critically question masculinity is completely tied up in our own mental health and in the way we treat people of other genders. So the sexism and the misogyny that so many boys are taught is oppressive to women, and it's psychologically damaging to men. And so we should be motivated to deal with it. And I think that's probably one of the things that keeps me up at night the most is why aren't more men motivated to deal with this? And what can we do to motivate them to deal with it? So, for example, you were talking about the courage that it takes and being disempowered. I think that's right. And I think it's probably not a coincidence that many men, when they do make some sort of change in this regard, it comes on the heels of a major life transformation, some sort of significant loss, a relational loss, a physical health issue, an awareness of mortality can often leave men, deer caught in the headlights. Like, who's around me? What are my relationships like? What is life like? And as painful as that is, I think we need to be present at those moments and supporting them as moments of change in the same way that we need to be present for 5 and 6-year-old boys who are getting beat up and mocked on the playground for crying because, we're seeing the effects of the earlier 40 years later in the adult life.
Yeah, and I think it's even more imperative that we start showing up for that now in our current world, because so much is changing about how we validate and create value for ourselves as men in this world. The idea of work is changing through a global pandemic and not being able to make money, certain people not being able to their jobs, laying off, not being able to provide in the same way that sort of the masculine archetype demands from us in our culture. When those dynamics are stripped away and are taken away, I think there's going to be some falling apart that happens. I think there is going to be some real crisis that men have to navigate. Everyone has to navigate during all of this. But I think we're specifically talking here about this sort of the way that we created success and well-being for ourselves may not be working anymore and may not even be available to us moving forward. There's a lot of unknown on the other side of this pandemic, on the other side of this upcoming election, on the other side. And I think it's even more imperative that we start showing up to catch men in crisis so that we can actually help support the pain and the suffering and the struggle rather than have it continue to lash out and do power over dynamics, which we're getting to see a lot of.
Yes, we are.
So a little bit ago, you had mentioned Donald Trump. I know you've had some personal experiences with him. Is there anything in those personal experiences that you'd like to share?
Well, just this story that I keep telling my partner, I'm going to call up NPR and what's it called? The Moth Radio Hour, because this is a true story and it happened to me and it seems significant. So the story goes like this, that in 2008, I was sitting in my office at Clark University and the phone rang, which already in 2008 was an unusual sort of thing to happen, for someone to actually call you in your office versus send you an email. And I answered the phone, and a woman on the other end said, "Is this Dr. Addis?" I said, "Yes, this is Dr. Addis. Would you please hold for Ms. Audrey Gruss?" And I said, "Sure," and sort of quick mental note, like I've never been asked to hold for someone else who someone dialed the phone for this person.
Yeah, that kicks in a different level of what's happening now.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's these little cues that you're entering a different world, but I didn't really make too much of it. And in any event, Audrey Gruss is a woman who has created a foundation called the Hope for Depression Research Foundation that has donated a tremendous amount of money for research on depression. And for their annual event that year, they wanted to focus on men and depression. And so she was calling to see if I would be willing to come to West Palm Beach and give a talk. And I said, absolutely. I would love to do that. And she said, great. We'll put you up, for for a couple of nights and we'll feed you and I think you'll have a great time. So I didn't think too much about it. I put together my regular slides for a talk like this, which included examples from popular media of some ways of constructing masculinity that research has shown to be associated with poor mental health. In other words, graphic representations of the bad messages from society, from my perspective as a researcher in all of this. And one of my favorite slides was a cover of Newsweek magazine in which Donald Trump was screaming, "You're fired," from his time on The Apprentice. And this was one of my slides. And when we arrived at, we were taken by limousine to what felt like just a huge estate, not a hotel. And when we arrived and walked into the waiting area, there was, in a large gold frame right in front of me, the exact same Newsweek magazine cover right there. And I sort of did a double take and looked at the woman at the reception desk and said, "Why is that here?" And she said, "Well, Mr. Trump likes to see it whenever he comes and goes." And that's when it hit me that we were at Mar-a-Lago. And I actually had dinner with Donald Trump and Melania Trump and about 5 other people that night, and lunch with the same group the next day, and got to watch Donald Trump and Melania Trump interact in the context of a fundraiser for men in depression that went on all day. We were sitting at the same table that whole time. Terry Bradshaw was also there, the former Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback. So at times I felt like it was in like a Fellini film or something like that. It was pretty strange.
Did you do this presentation in front of him that has him on a slide?
I took that slide out of my presentation. And I don't think he was at my presentation the next day, but there were, coincidentally, by the way, this was, I believe it was within 1 week of when the whole Madoff Ponzi scheme happened too. And that, I believe, dramatically affected some very wealthy people in that zip code right there. So
I'd imagine so.
Yeah, there were some unhappy looking men in the crowd. The one thing that I do remember from lunch that day is that Terry Bradshaw was the keynote speaker, and Terry has been really out front, well ahead of his time, about struggling with depression and ADHD, when there were very few professional athletes, if any, being honest about how pervasive a problem that is. So Terry got up and gave a very moving speech about his experience, and I think really supported the idea of destigmatizing all of this for men. Nothing better than a NFL football player in the largest sense. And when Terry came back to the table, he was sitting right across from me and right next to Trump, and Trump leaned over to him and said, "Terry, this depression stuff, you're not really being honest about this, are you?" And Terry said, "I am, absolutely." And Trump said, "I don't get it, because, I get down once in a while, but it's not like," and he mimicked putting a gun to his head and pulling the trigger, which struck me as the most, if I had to script something insensitive to do or to model for people in that context, I don't think I could have come up with that.
I wanted to pull you out on that because I think it's important to sort of use what we're seeing out there in the media to sort of describe behavioral things that are and prescribed behavioral patterns that can be really challenging for men. I really lean away from having either of us talk in terms of diagnoses or trying to sort of, I think that's a dangerous road when someone who's not someone's psychologist, psychiatrist going in and making a diagnosis on a celebrity. I think that can be a dangerous game to play. But I do think that's it's a powerful story of a man out there vulnerably speaking about a challenge that he's navigating and trying to normalize something, and then a very typical response, not necessarily the gun to the head piece, the mimicking of a gun to the head, but the complete lack of empathy and understanding and almost dismissiveness that somebody would be having that experience. That's something that I so want to support men in developing, is that ability to recognize that just because it's not part of your experience does not mean it's not real. I think we're so trained as men to believe that, well, if I haven't experienced it, it's probably not real. And I think that's where the disconnect is happening so often between us and people of other genders, from people that are not the same race that we are. There's a disconnect there because if it's not a part of our own experience, it must not be real, or it must not be as valuable or valid as it would be if it was mine.
I think that's right. I think that's a sort of an example of a real failure of empathy. And I think what you're talking about, this challenge of perspective taking and our decreased ability to do it, it's not helped by how polarizing the discourse is around us. You know, we think we know other people's experience, and yet we often don't, because we put them in a box, right? I mean, it can be as simple as, the box can be as simple as male, female, right? Or gay, straight, or Republican, Democrat, or whatever it may be. But as soon as that binary thinking starts happening, then all of the nuance is lost and all of the individual uniqueness of the person that you're interacting with. And I think, I don't have data on this, but I think as men, we're often especially susceptible to that. Why? Because we aren't as real with each other. I don't know who you really are often. You know, I talk about this in my book, Invisible Men, that the degree to which, as my friend Crystal Martin always says, the degree to which most guys think most guys are most guys, but most guys are not most guys. In other words, most guys are different on the inside than we let other guys see. Most of us do have challenges and problems in our lives and wish we could be more open and honest. And yet, if we're not showing that to others and we're not responding empathically when others show it to us, then the myth that men are just fine, everything's okay, continues.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that you say that, because I just had a person ask me recently, like, why do certain men that aren't actually really lining up with the traditional masculine ideals being touted as someone to listen to about what it is to be a man, like a Ben Shapiro kind of person? Like, why are there a lot of young incel type men like following this man and listening to what he has to say? He doesn't represent, at least what I've internalized as traditional masculine ideas, the way that he looks, the way that any of the way, other than the power over dynamics, maybe.
What's he? I'm not familiar with him. Is there a masculinity sort of that he's selling, or is he?
In some ways, he looks like the I don't want to say it in a judgment, but the stereotype that we talk about of like the nerd in high school, like just kind of some like not big, broad, diminutive, like not exhibiting sort of the prowess of masculinity that we are all sort of reaching for. He doesn't match those standards, and yet he has quite a big following.
I see. Yeah, and so that's such a great example, because this falls for me under the category of, this is all pretty nuanced and complicated, this whole question of how masculinity gets done in our lives. Because on the one hand, you know, the idea that young men and emerging adult men who are looking for alternative versions of masculinity, who aren't the big football players dating the cheerleaders, you know, who maybe have intellectual or creative interests, or they're the ones that would be, let's say, bullied. It's great that they're looking for alternatives. And at the same time, if people continue to have to find a manhood that they feel good about, you know, or continue to strive to be masculine, is that really fundamental change that's happening here? It sounds like, I don't know too much about this individual that we're talking about, but if I think about what I do know about the incel movement, For example, one of the things that they seem to be saying is that their right to intimate relationships with women is not being honored. Right? And so you see as you say, a power over, or one might say a sexual entitlement, or even a form of misogyny that comes along with this sort of new masculinity, if you will.
I think it actually, now that I think about it, it goes back to what you were saying previously about when somebody has been disempowered in our culture, they will look to models that will empower them. And if you're being empowered, you're still going to be using the same sort of power over dynamics that have been used against. It's sort of like the shadow recreating itself. It's if someone's been wounded people create more wounding. And it's, you start to look for people that will validate and empower your experience, even though you might have been picked on. I see that in the gay community all the time. A bunch of wounded boys rewounding each other because people haven't really done their work. And so we're still playing out sort of these toxic relational patterns where we're trying to decide who is better, more attractive, more physically muscular, we're still playing out those traditional masculine ideas, even within a community that has been rejected in terms of masculinity as a whole.
So you still see what I would call the policing of masculinity. It's just men establishing some sort of hierarchy of order and policing each other's behavior according to gender norms that are heterosexist in their origin.
For sure.
That's really sad.
You just need to sign on to one dating app that has gay men in it, and you'll see it. They're policing each other, saying no fat, no feminine men. I'm a mask for mask. I only want masculine men. There's this rejection of femininity. There's a rejection of no blacks, no Asians, There's always these sort of like classifications of who is valid and valuable and who isn't. And masked with, well, it's just what I'm attracted to. But nobody's doing the like thoughtful questions about, well, why am I attracted to that?
Right.
What has my culture taught me about what is attractive and what isn't attractive? Where is the sort of nurture end of things? There's the nature, what do we come into and what are we attracted to? But what is the nurture part of it? And if you're not asking that question, you're not digging deep enough, I don't think. And you're actually just perpetuating similar problematic, misogynistic, heteronormative things that don't really, like, we're free from that. We get to have that privilege. Let's step forward in a new way and recreate something new.
Right.
And I think we are starting to head in that direction, but I do see that as a challenge where when people are wounded, they will often recreate that wounding outside of themselves.
Yes, and we'll also do it in absolutely pervasive and normative ways that are perhaps less damaging or traumatizing, but are shaping the clay over time. So I know there are aspects of what we might call traditional masculinity, like prowess in sports, that I'm still struggling with this. I still have to, if I go out and I play disc golf or I play basketball and I'm not doing the behavior the way that I expect myself to do it, I have to wrestle with that internalized shame associated with that. And I guess I believe that it's possible to let that go. In my field in psychology, there's lots of different contingents, and there are, and in society as well. For example, there's the point of view that, evolution has hardwired all men to always want to be competitive. And I think that the metaphor of hardwired is a problematic metaphor, right? The effects of evolution may be there, but that certainly does not mean we have no choices and no agency to create the kind of nurture that we want, like you were just saying.
What do you think that is, that whole rejection of our own agency? Like, I see that happening a lot in men and masculinity around, well, I have urges. I have to follow them. I have to, anger is hardwired in men. I have to express it. Like, what is that sort of rejection of agency and the desire to live unbound from some sort of like socially kind way of being in community?
Well, I think it's privilege and backlash. So the privilege is what it is to be male in a patriarchal society that creates certain expectations of what one is entitled to. So if I'm turned on, that means I'm an urge, and I have an urge. I am an urge. And if I can't have satisfaction, then somehow, nature has been disrupted. So, and that's the pushback, right? Is that because when you attribute things to nature, this is the way it is. I think it's often not a scientific statement people are making. It's a moral and political one. They're saying, in effect, I don't want to change this. This is the way society is supposed to work. So, yeah, I'm probably with you on that. I'm really committed these days to calling out the lack of agency language when it happens.
Yeah, me too. I don't see men as victims in that. And it's hard for me when I hear the stories around. It's like, it's hard to be a man these days. Yes, it is. And not for the reasons that people are using that phrasing. It's not hard to be a man because you're expected to not sexually harass people and not forcibly use your power to get sex out of someone. That you're not a victim to that.
Right.
that is our work as men to do, is to recognize our privilege and power and to start using it in ways that create agency, that give support to others, that empower others, that don't just hoard power and keep it for ourselves and get offended when someone calls us out on something. So I kind of want to talk with you a little bit more about your book, The Psychology of Men in Context. Give me a little brief overview of why this book was important for you to write.
Well, we talked about teaching the psychology of men, and I think it's probably not uncommon for people who teach a course for several years to end up writing a book for it. I feel like I've learned as much from my students' reactions to the material as I have from studying it formally, and so I wanted to provide a book that presented all the ideas that we talk about, many of the things we're talking about today and beyond, but presented them in a way that spoke to the lived experience of people who aren't professionals in this field. So what does this have to do with my relationships with people, with the way I treat my body? And how is this information used in society is something we focus on quite a bit in the book. So for every theory, we consider in relation to men and masculinity, we also consider how that perspective is used in the media, in law, and in everyday interaction between people. So for example, the question of whether, men's sexuality is driven by an irresistible urge. That's out there in society. And then there are also scientists who take a similar point of view. So yeah, I think it was just a way to try to gather all of that together in a digestible way. You read it. So how was it for you? Was it digestible?
It's absolutely digestible. And I think so much of the conversations that I've been having, I think I shared this with you before, is that I come from sort of the one-on-one work that I'm doing with men, or my own experiences of navigating masculinity and a felt sense of what's true in this. And so being able to zoom out and take a more meta perspective on how is the research being done around this and how is it academically being looked at is really important, because I think the perspective you take on it influences the way that you will see this. And I think something that you in this book lay out so well is that I think there's like 5 different perspectives when sort of looking at masculinity. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those perspectives are that social scientists are using to look at masculinity?
Sure. So yeah, well, we begin the book. I think the first perspective we cover is a biological or evolutionary perspective. And the idea there is that you can understand a good deal of men's thoughts, actions, behaviors, and feelings by looking at the way human beings evolved 10,000 years ago. So the sort of core metaphor here is that we've got a caveman's brain in a modern culture. And if you think about the challenges that provides to that brain and what the decision-making mechanisms might be in such a brain, you can begin to explain some of the inequalities that we see vis-a-vis gender, and also some more, specific aspects of men's behavior. And then I guess you might say, if that's the nature perspective, the nurture perspective would be what we cover in the next chapter, which is social learning. And this is really about the way boys are taught to be men and the messages that we internalize. It's sort of a top-down process, if you will. So you can imagine society being filled with, bubbles of beliefs. Men shouldn't cry. Men should be tough. Men should make a lot of money. Men should be heterosexual. Men shouldn't ask for help. And they sort of float into our minds and become no longer external. Now they're internal. The next perspective we consider is a social constructionist perspective. And at its heart, it's really about the idea that masculinity is what we make it. And it puts the lens on the way people, as individuals and as groups, construct, put together ideas. So, for example, if you watch professional sports, you can see the social construction of masculinity happening moment to moment as players are called the ultimate men and needing to man up and are praised for controlling their emotions and praised for enduring pain and that sort of thing. It's the actual construction of those little bubbles up there in the sky. And then in the next two chapters, we actually consider something that I think psychology has often missed, but is incredibly important, which is the broader social context of men and masculinity. So not just what is in men's minds, but how is gender structured in society? So we consider a feminist perspective on men and masculinity, which really emphasizes power relations between the genders as being a major part of the dynamics of how gender unfolds in people's lives. And then we also consider what is called an intersectional perspective that really questions the idea that people are a unitary self. So, for example, my identity is not just as a man, but also as a white man. And not just as a white man, but as a white man who was raised Jewish, and as a white heterosexual man who was raised Jewish. And also I would, much as I don't feel this way, statistically speaking, I'm wealthy. So my race, my gender, my sexual orientation, my socioeconomic class are all parts of my identity. And I think when you look at people that way and realize to what degree our experiences are shaped by those identities, we realize that there probably is no universal men or masculinity thing out there, right? There's my white male, cisgender, straight, older, liberal way of doing masculinity. And there's Black gay male surfer masculinities too in the right context. And so I think it's really important to think about people at that degree of intersection in our identities.
I'm so glad that part of it's covered in the book, because I think that's an important value of mine while doing this podcast, is to have a really cross section of people so that it's not just the assumption that my version of masculinity is the way it is. It's to bring in queer people, to bring in Black people, to bring in Asian folks, to bring in people that represent different socioeconomic statuses, careers, married, single, all over the gender binary spectrum, so that we can have a real conversation about where are people, so that we can understand how masculinity impacts us all, and that we can sort of develop the empathetic understanding that somebody else's version of it is going to impact them in a deeper way sometimes, or in a different way than it might impact me as a white man in this world.
Exactly.
Something else I really wanted to highlight was from the chapter on feminist perspectives, where you offer some of the barriers that are present for men in terms of acknowledging their privilege. We were talking about privilege earlier, and I think there are barriers to recognizing it, and there is that sort of pushing back when asked to look at our privilege as men, because there's so many men that have had challenging experiences, and so they're like, well, if I've had all these experiences, so I can't have privilege. Can you help me understand, or help the listeners understand, what some of those barriers are actually? Can you sort of define them for us?
Yeah. Well, I think that it in coming off of the part of our conversation of talking about intersectionality, I'm hesitant to generalize about men. And I think privilege is a good example of how this doesn't always work out, thinking about men in general, because, for example, if you are a white male, there is a certain structural privilege that you would enjoy, or at least benefit from if you don't enjoy it, that a black male on average is not going to have access to. And then you layer sexual orientation on top of that, right? Or socioeconomic status, and it gets complicated real quick. But having said that, if I think generally about barriers to acknowledging privilege, the first thing that comes to mind is that privilege hides itself. One of the privileges is not having to think about your privilege. It's just a sort of a normal thing that one goes through. And there's certainly, if you begin to contemplate your privilege as a man, there usually will be no shortage of other men around you to tell you to stop talking about that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to be an uphill climb. It's a surmountable one for sure. But I think getting those first couple steps, we sometimes have to overcome the inertia that's associated with privilege to begin with. The other thing is that this is where I think coming at it as a psychologist maybe influences my understanding of this. But I have met countless men whose identities put them in a position of privilege, without a doubt, and whose lived experience at the time was anything but powerful. They felt disempowered, depressed, afraid, perhaps had been fired from their job, perhaps couldn't make a mortgage payment. It would be very hard for many of these men to acknowledge the privilege in their gender identity in that kind of situation. And I think it takes some work. It takes, for example, recognizing the difference between privilege, or let's take the reverse, the difference between being oppressed versus being restricted. So gender, that's a little abstract, but let's say something like gender, masculinity, it's there, it oppresses women. It structurally oppresses them. It's built into society in a way that values men and devalues women. But it doesn't oppress men. It's not like I can't get a job because of masculinity, right? But what it does is restrict my potential psychologically. And that's what I see with a lot of men who have a hard time acknowledging their privileges, that they're so psychologically restricted by gender, right, that they feel disempowered.
Yeah, I think there's a nice way that people have been putting it these days when sort of having this conversation of privilege and power, which is happening all over the United States at least, is that privilege isn't about what you have been through, because those are valid experiences that you have. It's more about what you haven't had to face, what you haven't had to acknowledge, what you haven't had. And I think that's why it's that barrier. That's why it sort of hides itself, because it's not about the challenging experiences that you have had, which are important to acknowledge and that are valid and that are important to you as a being in this world. But being willing to ask the questions about what you haven't had to experience based on whichever privilege identifier that you may or may not have is the important place to start looking.
That's really helpful. I had not heard it described that way before, but I think that's really useful, because I think that's something where a lot of men could acknowledge that. For example, I have friends that don't have the same financial resources that I have. And I have heard them say in conversations about male privilege, because I bring it up, that's not me. But I think if I ask them, well, what are examples of things you haven't had to contend with? So, for example, like in race, have you had to contend with someone assuming that you were shoplifting because of the color of your skin? I think they would acknowledge, maybe it's just because they're New Englanders, but I think they would acknowledge, yeah, that is a privilege.
Yeah, I mean, it is confusing in some ways, and it does take a nuanced approach. Like, as a gay white man, I belong to a community of people that has been oppressed, as well as I also have privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can be very easy to slip into sort of the pain part of my identity and to use that to invalidate my privilege and say I don't have privilege. But the reality is I do. I don't often walk through city neighborhoods and feel afraid at night. That's a privilege I have as a man. That's a privilege I have as a white man. There are certain ways in which I just don't have to worry about my interactions with police, with different versions of authority because of the way that I look. And so for a lot of men, it is going to take a sort of a nuanced approach to things to really look at where are the places that you do have pain, that are valid, that are important to your beingness, but where are the places that you haven't had to experience some of those things, some of these things that have kept people out of power? Because that's how we do the work around this. There's a page in the book, I think it's page 121. I would encourage people to get this book, and if you're curious about this, but there's an exercise that's offered on sort of unpacking and reflecting on privilege for men, because it is so hidden and confusing and challenging to sort of be aware of. I think it's important for people to explore different ways of uncovering and looking for it. I think one of the last pieces that I had that made sense to me, especially in context of the US culture, is one of the barriers to seeing privilege is the belief in meritocracy. We're sold that as members of the United States. If I pull myself up by my bootstraps, if I work really hard, that's where I will be rewarded. And that we're sold this linear belief system that is hard work equals success. And yet I have lots of real life evidence where that's not true of the people I witness in my life. As being a social worker with a master's degree and working really hard to save children's lives by being an investigator in child protective services, I was not rewarded in this culture with levels of success.
No. That kind of work is not rewarded with money and success and respect, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think it's important to start looking at what our culture has taught us and to start questioning it and to look around at the real lived experiences of a lot of people that belief in meritocracy, it's a belief, it's not truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a belief that serves a function. I don't think it's random that it exists everywhere. I think what it does is it tells us to congratulate ourselves if we're doing well and blame people who aren't doing well for lack of effort or ability. And I think that's wrong. It's not just morally problematic. Psychological research shows that our abilities as people to judge what went into our own success and others is severely limited. We're very biased in the way we explain our own and other people's accomplishments, and we're self-serving in the way that we do that. So I appreciate you talking about, and you used this term several times, of the work that we need to do. And it's hard work. And I think part of it, if we're going to work on privilege, is really soberly acknowledging to ourselves that not every success we've had has been the result of our own merit. Right? There are ways in which, I'm sure if you went back and played the movie of me getting my PhD and becoming a professor, there were countless times where I said things that if I had been a woman, people would have rolled their eyes and instead sort of took it as a perfectly legitimate behavior. I can't think of one off the top of my head because they're as mundane as talking about a research article and what's considered smart. Who's given the advantage in thinking that they're smart. And so giving up the credit that we give ourselves, I think is important. The reward on the other side is, I think, a greater sense of connection with other people. Like I've noticed that for myself as I do this work thinking about gender, but also about race and also about class, that as I start to see the way my life has unfolded intersectionally, I start to see other people that way too. And in some ways, almost paradoxically, the shared humanity comes out of that as well. And I think that's a real benefit in an increasingly multicultural world.
Yeah, absolutely. It sort of aligns with this new, as I continue to put my work out there into the world, and I keep fine tuning the messaging of it and continue like really honing in on what is sort of essentially Travis about this men and masculinity work. Part of what I'm coming to is that I believe in men's work that not only is about freeing men from the limitations of masculinity, the sort of narrow lanes that are allowed in our current ideals of masculinity, but the other side of it has to be active engagement with repair work where harm has been done through masculinity to others, to this planet, to ourselves. And without that active engagement in the harm repair, it's just not as interesting to me anymore. It's just not enough. We need that extra piece that's looking inward to do the work. That's why I'm having only men and masculine identifying people on this podcast. There's plenty of women that have been doing this work for us for a long time, that have been doing our emotional labor for us, that have been part of, as we were talking about, like gender studies, have been evolving our concepts and ideas about ourselves for so long, that it's time to gather together as men to start doing that work ourselves, not to rely on the women in our lives to do it for us.
I think that's really important. I'd love to talk to you sometime about gay straight men and relationships of alliance and gay straight friendships as well, because I still see around me a major divide that's happening there. And it makes sense. I get that as we've been talking about, like people have different experiences based on the way society is structured. And for example, there are way more shared experiences than I think we're tapping into, as evidenced by your own example of what you see happening in the gay community. And I'm not convinced by people who say we're in a post-homophobic culture either. There's a literature out there on that suggests we've transcended that, and I am just not seeing it.
It's not my lived experience.
Yeah.
There are very few heterosexual men that I can be in relationship with and friends with where I get to bring all of me to the table. I can bring a socially acceptable version of me, and there's a tolerance of the gay part of it, but not a full accepting and embracing part of it, because there's still all this messaging around rejecting femininity and rejecting gayness. And I'm not that. I don't want other people to think I'm with him. There's still all of this sort of like, what does that mean about me if I genuinely accept this gay man across from me?
Yeah. Even on the West Coast and in the Northwest.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say it's very rare for me to have that experience where I get to bring 100% of me to the table. With obviously, like, that doesn't mean that I'm going to try to have sex with every man that I'm friends with. That doesn't mean that, but that I get to bring my real lived experience and talk about who I am and what my experiences are in a real way, without feeling that wall go up or that rejection piece, that potential for rejection piece come out around certain topics. Imagine with most straight men, I can't talk about my sex life or have the sort of ability to share experiences that I've been through around my sex life because there's such a rejection there.
Right. And it's I'm sure no coincidence that you joked about like having to do the disclaimer of not that I want to have sex with everyone, because I think that's what often comes up, I think, for straight men, is like this sort of projection onto gay men that if we're going to have an intimate relationship or a friendly relationship or even just beyond a superficial relationship, that it's necessarily from the gay man's perspective a sexual relationship. And that's just not accurate based on what I know of people. And it's a harmful stereotype as well.
And I think it's a projection.
Yes, of your own fear. Yeah.
Yeah, of your own fear. And because so many men don't want to have to control their urges and don't want to take agency over of their sexuality in certain ways, they assume that gay men can't do it. That there's this projection that they're going to treat me like I treat the women that I rule over. So I think there is a real projection and this real sort of like inherent fear that, oh, I'm doing this to them, they're going to do this to me.
That's really helpful. Thank you for that. The parallel with the uncontrollable urge and the power over thing.
Yeah, and I appreciate you pointing out my qualification about it doesn't mean I want to have sex with them, because that does come from that. That does come from that vulnerable place of me saying, I want to show up 100% in a relationship. And the immediate thing that goes up in my mind is that's not safe. Watch out. People are going to assume you mean something, and then you're going to get rejected. That's the lived experience that I'm talking about, where that's the messaging I've received. So yes, I'd love to continue our conversations about this, because it's actually a passionate spot of mine, because I think there's some real beauty and healing that can come from gay straight relationships and friendships, where gay men get to repattern some of the masculine wound that's there for them, whereas straight men get to repattern that, but they also get more access to the feminine side. There is a privilege that I own being a gay man, that because I've already failed as in the traditional masculine way, I get to own my feminine side.
Now it's all good.
Yeah, totally. I get more freedom to explore. I get to be more authentically who I am. And being in relationship with a straight man, that man can sort of see my freedom and start to play with how they create that for themselves. So this is such a passionate topic of mine, and I think we can keep going in the future conversations about this.
Definitely.
One last thing I wanted to point out from your book that I think is such an important part of what I've been experiencing as I put this work out there in the world is it comes in the very first part of the introduction, where you're talking about the guidelines that the APA released, the American Psychological Association released around men's work. And there's sort of this deep divide between how those were received. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the American Psychological Association spent, I want to say over 10 years putting together recommendations for doing mental health work with men and boys. And recommendations consisted of things like support the emotional development of men and boys, recognize that traditional masculine ideologies can be harmful to men's mental health, and so on. And what we saw when those hit the press was a significant backlash in many circles. I think it's probably safe to say predominantly within more acknowledged conservative circles on the political spectrum. But what happened was that they interpreted the idea that masculinity can be a problem for men and something worth working on in therapy. They interpreted that as an indictment of men. So the idea is that if you critique masculinity or question it, you're pathologizing or critiquing men, and so that it's an anti-male document. You know, in retrospect, it seems to me, well, of course, some people are going to see it that way. But the degree of reaction, how something like that from the American Psychological Association could end up on Fox News primetime is beyond me. If that doesn't speak to the moment that we're at and the relevance of these issues, I don't know what does.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was my experience from the very first episode that I posted of this podcast, not in my communities and in my circles, but when friends of mine started sharing in different groups, there was a huge reaction to a gay man talking about masculinity. There was this huge rejection piece of like, oh, he's trying to feminize us and to make us into women and to be a betas. And like, there was this huge reaction in some circles around even opening up this dialogue and having this conversation. Not telling men what to do, but just being curious and asking about real men's experiences.
Yeah, I mean, this is a major reason why we wrote the book as well, was to arm people with an understanding not only of the psychological research, but the political landscape in which this research finds its way. Because ultimately, I guess I believe change occurs in a grassroots kind of way, and it's going to be through interactions between people, that we make substantive change. And to have those, you need a language as a set of tools for describing your experience in some ways.
Oh, I love that you just said that, because it sort of resonates with, I hadn't really put it into words, but what I think of the mission of this podcast is very grassroots. It's gathering together and collecting with men who are ready to have those questions, that are taking a critical eye to this, that are looking at what's not working, but are also looking at where this could go. And it's also about building a language set for us to have a conversation. And it's developing over time. My language set around this is changing as I continue having these dialogues, and it's informed by the experiences of other men and masculine identifying people that I talk with. So thank you for, you sort of synthesized kind of what I see this work as in saying that.
You're welcome.
Well, there's so much that I think we could continue talking about. I want to honor our time together by sort of asking you one final question, which is, if you could give men one piece of advice, what would that be?
I think it's really, really useful and important for men to take an interest in their emotional lives and in their relationships, and in a curious and a passionate way to do the work. I see tremendous value in that for everyone in society, not just individual men themselves. And I think there are ways to do that. There are books to read. There are conversations to be had.
Do you have what is the first step maybe that men could take to start that journey if they were hearing this?
How am I doing? How am I really doing? What do people know about me, and what don't people know about me? I would take an personal inventory about that. I sometimes ask men, not so much what are you feeling, but what's happening on the inside that other people can't see. In whatever language you have available to describe that, I think it's a really important first step. And then I'd say the next step is beginning to share that with someone important to you, by taking, measured risks.
Yeah, it's funny because it seems so simple, and yet it is like radical to say that. Just start asking yourself some questions and asking what is on the inside that people can't see. I think that's so simple and yet radical all at the same time for men.
I agree.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So if people wanted to connect with you or find out more about your work in the world, how might they do that?
Sure. Well, people can reach me via email at Clark University. It's MADDIS, Mattis, at clarku.edu. That's probably the best way. And then my books are available on Amazon.com if someone wants to read. And yeah, I'd be happy to converse with people from your podcast.
Also consider looking for Michael's book at local bookstores, trying to support local businesses as we are navigating this wild time. I think I still am somebody that uses Amazon from time to time. I live in Amazon Central in Seattle, so you can't really escape it. But I also like to encourage people to continue looking for smaller, locally owned places to find those things. But if you can't, Amazon is a great place to a one-stop shop for a lot of different things. So what are the names of your books that you would like to highlight? We've been talking today about the psychology of men in context. What are the other books that you have?
The other book on men and masculinity is called Invisible Men: Men's Inner Lives and the Consequences of Silence.
Oh, just a light read, huh?
Yes. Right. Just like our whole conversation.
Oh yeah, totally. I don't do things lightly, that's for sure. Well, thank you so much for being a part of this. It's been a real pleasure having you. I really thank you for you bringing just Michael to this, but also all of the sort of research in the background and the the history that you have of knowledge that is around this topic. I think the more and more we get a broad picture of some of this stuff, the more and more it helps us look at ourselves as, it helps men start to be able to actually look at these things because we're normalizing this through what has been seen through research over time. It's no longer about you as a personal failure. Here's where the system is failing you. Here's where you are continuing to follow rules that have been given to you that may not be serving you. And it gives permission to start doing that work when people like you and I normalize that experience. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. If people want to connect with me, you can go to my website at travisstock.com. You can also email me at travisstock03@gmail.com. Or you can go to my Instagram at traver03. It's where I'm continuing to have this ongoing conversation. These podcast episodes are static and they are powerful and important, but I continue to have a live conversation on my social media with people who are listening. You can also find me on Patreon at patreon.com/thenewmasculine. I'm using that space as a way to help continue funding this movement that we're creating here on The New Masculine, but also to help pay it forward to other organizations that are doing good work in the world. This month, we are currently taking portions of those contributions and we're donating to the Bradbury Sullivan LGBT Community Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is providing resources to LGBT people across Pennsylvania, but also doing education across the country. So you can find us there on Patreon. Thank you so much, Michael, for participating in this conversation with me, and I look forward to yours and my continued conversations.
Sounds good. Be well.